the Monkees first toured Australia in 1968, fans were hospitalised for hysteria. And 50 years later, the fans of the Monkees are just as passionate. Michael Nesmith and Micky Dolenz are the only surviving members of the hit band.
At 81, Micky Dolenz has opened up about why he refused the Monkees reunion tour. Today, we'll see what happens when a band born as a television illusion becomes more real and more complicated than the system that created it. For the last surviving constant face of the Monkees, the idea of getting the band back together no longer means recapturing the past. It means deciding whether that past should be simplified into nostalgia or told as the fractured, unpredictable story it actually was. But to make any sense of this complicated story, we need to step back and start from the very beginning. A manufactured dream that refused to stay controlled. Los Angeles, 1965. Inside a casting office, NBC and producer Bert Schneider were assembling a fictional rock band designed to ride the cultural wave created by the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night. The project, soon to become the Monkees, was built from auditions, screen tests, and personality chemistry. Out of hundreds of hopefuls, 4 young men were selected: Micky Dolenz, Davy Jones, Michael Nesmith, and Peter Tork. None of them were hired because they had already formed a band. They were hired because they could become one on screen. The show premiered on September 12, 1966, on NBC, and almost immediately blurred the line between fiction and reality. The Monkees were portrayed as a struggling pop group living in a beachside pad in Malibu, writing songs between comedic misadventures. Within weeks, the fictional band had become a real commercial force. Their debut single, Last Train to Clarksville, released in August 1966, hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, selling over 1 million copies. It was followed by I'm a Believer, written by Neil Diamond, which also reached #1 and became one of the best-selling singles of 1967 in the United States. But behind the chart, success was a strict division of labor. None of the 4 members had fully anticipated this issue. The music they were performing as the Monkees was not initially played by them. Instead, it was crafted by seasoned Los Angeles session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew, while production was overseen by Don Kirshner, a music publisher who controlled the band's early catalog. Kirshner's system was efficient and commercially aggressive. Pair top songwriters like Tommy Boyce, Bobby Hart, and Neil Sedaka with elite studio musicians, then attach the Monkees' faces to the finished product. In 1967 alone, the Monkees released 2 albums, More of the Monkees and Headquarters, both of which reached #1 on the Billboard 200. The tension came from a simple but explosive contradiction. The world saw a band, but the members were not yet allowed to be one. Michael Nesmith, already a songwriter before joining the show, became the most vocal internal challenger. He pushed back against Kirshner's control, arguing that the group should play their own instruments and have authority over what was released under their name. Peter Tork, who had a strong background in folk and multi-instrumental performance from the Greenwich Village music scene, supported this push. Davy Jones also resisted being treated as a purely manufactured performer. By early 1967, friction escalated into a direct confrontation. Control wars and musical rebellion. The tension detonated publicly when Kirshner released A Little Bit Me, A Little Bit You in February 1967 without consulting the band. The single, written by Neil Diamond, climbed quickly on the Billboard Hot 100, but the decision bypassed the group entirely. For Nesmith, it was not just a creative disagreement. It was an authority breach. Within days, he confronted Kirshner directly during a meeting in Los Angeles, threatening to quit the show if control was not handed over. The conflict escalated beyond internal frustration into a corporate-level dispute involving NBC Screen Gems and Colgham's Records. By early 1967, the revolt became formal. The Monkees demanded to play their own instruments and select their own material. It was an unusual move in the 1960s pop culture, where producers typically controlled every aspect of a manufactured act. But the pressure worked. Kirshner was eventually removed from overseeing the group's recording output, marking one of the rare instances in which a studio-created band successfully overturned its production hierarchy. The result of this rebellion was Headquarters, released on May 22, 1967. Recorded primarily at RCA Studio B in Hollywood, the album was constructed as a statement rather than just a collection of songs. Nearly all instruments were played by the four members, with only limited external assistance. The opening track, You Told Me, written by Nesmith, immediately signaled the shift. This was no longer a controlled pop product, but an attempt at a self-defined identity. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 and sold over 2 million copies in the United States, proving that creative independence did not necessarily come at the cost of commercial success. Yet, the victory was structurally unstable. The shift exposed a reality that had been hidden under the earlier production system. The members were not equally developed musicians. Nesmith was a seasoned guitarist and songwriter. Tork was versatile and musically literate, comfortable switching between instruments. Dolenz was still consolidating his identity as a drummer, often learning parts under tight studio timelines. Jones, despite strong vocal ability and stage charisma, was less involved in instrumental work. As Headquarters climbed the charts, another internal experiment followed almost immediately. The band began working on Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited, which was released later in 1967. The album partially retreated from the full self-play model, reintroducing session musicians alongside the group. The reason was not failure, but exhaustion and complexity. Playing every instrument while maintaining a television production schedule proved difficult. The shift signaled something deeper than logistics. It showed that independence had created its own complications. Meanwhile, the public perception war intensified. Critics who had dismissed the Monkees as a fabricated imitation of the Beatles were forced to reassess, but they did not fully reverse their stance. Instead, the narrative split. Some viewed Headquarters as proof of legitimacy, while others saw it as an overcorrection driven by public pressure. The band, caught in between, began to experience internal disagreement, not just about control, but about identity itself. By late 1967, the cohesion that once came from external direction had been replaced by internal negotiation. Decisions that had once been made by producers were now debated among 4 individuals with different priorities, strengths, and ambitions. The Monkees had achieved what they initially demanded: creative control. But in doing so, they had removed the structure that made their rapid rise possible. They were self-directed and commercially successful, but also increasingly uncertain about what direction self-directed actually meant. This was not all, though. Things were about to get much worse. Peter Tork's downward spiral. The collapse of the Monkees' original run in 1971 did not end on stage or in a studio. It ended in silence, contracts expiring, and 4 men stepping into radically different realities. For Peter Tork, that transition was not a clean exit from fame, but a slow drift away from structure itself. Unlike Michael Nesmith, who pivoted into country rock experimentation, or Micky Dolenz, who leaned into acting and voice work, Tork entered a period marked by instability, inconsistent income, and repeated attempts to rebuild a musical identity outside the machinery that had once defined him. By the early 1970s, Tork was moving through a fragmented career landscape. He formed short-lived projects, including the band Release, which failed to achieve commercial traction. He also took on non-musical work, including teaching guitar and working odd jobs to stabilize his finances. Projects would form, show promise, and dissolve without momentum. In interviews later in life, Tork described this era as disorienting, shaped by sudden wealth in his early 20s, followed by a rapid loss. Tork also experienced issues with alcohol abuse and use of controlled substances during the post-Monkees years, particularly in the early to mid-1970s. This was part of a broader pattern of instability that affected his professional reliability and personal decision-making. In 1972, he was arrested in the United States for the possession of an illegal substance, an incident that resulted in legal consequences, including a short prison sentence and fines, marking one of the clearest documented low points of his early post-band years. That arrest became a turning point in his biography, not because it ended his career, but because it symbolized how far he had moved from the controlled environment of television studios and record label oversight into an unstructured personal landscape. Unlike the Monkees' early years, where schedules, producers, and scripts dictated behavior, this phase was defined by the absence of external control. For Tork, that absence created room for both experimentation and excess. Throughout the 70s, his career remained inconsistent. He contributed to various musical collaborations, but rarely maintained long-term stability in any project. Financial pressures increased as the Monkees' royalties fluctuated, and new ventures failed to generate comparable income. At times, he worked in teaching roles, but even those positions were not permanent. The instability reinforced a cycle common among former pop stars of the era. Early fame followed by uneven employment, compounded by lifestyle pressures. All of this led him to substance dependency. However, by the end of the decade, Tork's situation began to shift toward recovery. He gradually reduced substance use and entered a more reflective phase of his life. The 1980s also brought an unexpected resurgence. Reunions, resentments, and the business of nostalgia. By the early 1980s, the Monkees had been inactive as a unified performing group for over a decade, but they never fully disappeared from the cultural system that created them. What changed first wasn't the band, it was the audience. MTV's launch in 1981 brought back reruns of the Monkees television series, reintroducing the pop experiment that lasted from 1966 to 1968 to a new generation that had never lived through Beatlemania or the original broadcast run. The effect was immediate and measurable: renewed merchandise demand, soundtrack reissues, and a sharp resurgence in fan engagement that industry executives quickly recognized as commercially viable nostalgia capital. That resurgence set the stage for the 1986 reunion tour, the first major coordinated comeback involving multiple original members since the early 1970s. Micky Dolenz, Peter Tork, and Davy Jones formed the core touring lineup after Michael Nesmith declined full participation due to his solo career and commitments in country rock and music video production. The tour became a legitimate commercial success, playing large venues across North America and proving that the Monkees brand still carried enough cultural weight to function as a live entertainment product. This was nearly 20 years after its television debut, but structurally, the reunion did not resolve the underlying tension that had existed since the 1960s. Instead, it reactivated it under new conditions. The difference now was not control over recording studios, but control over performance identity. Set lists became the first pressure point. Promoters pushed for predictable hits, I'm a Believer, Last Train to Clarksville, and Daydream Believer, tracks that guaranteed audience response and ticket sales. The band members, however, increasingly debated how much space should be given to deeper cuts and solo material. As the touring cycle extended into the 1990s, the group's internal structure became increasingly unstable. Lineups shifted depending on availability, health, and contractual alignment. Davy Jones and Micky Dolenz often remained central to tours, while Peter Tork's participation became intermittent. Financial arrangements, including revenue splits and management oversight, became recurring points of friction. Unlike the 1960s, where disputes centered on creative authority under a producer like Don Kirshner, the later conflicts were shaped by business logistics. Who owned the brand in practice? How should the touring income be distributed among rotating configurations of members? That kind of stuff. By the early 2000s, these tensions became more visible in public reporting. Touring versions of the Monkees operated with shifting personnel, sometimes under names that emphasized individual members rather than a unified band identity. Peter Tork, in particular, was involved in cycles of joining and exiting touring lineups, often tied to disagreements over management decisions, scheduling, and financial structure. In several instances, reported reorganizations of touring personnel led to perceptions of members being replaced or sidelined mid-cycle. The core issue was how to package the brand's legacy. One faction leaned toward a straightforward nostalgia model. Maximize attendance by focusing on recognizable hits, minimize deviation, and treat the concerts as a living greatest hits archive. Another perspective, often associated with members like Dolenz and Tork at different points in time, leaned toward narrative performance, incorporating storytelling, context about deceased members such as Davy Jones and later Michael Nesmith, and acknowledging the group's complex origin as a television construct. Financial disputes intensified this divide. Touring revenue in nostalgia circuits can be substantial, especially for legacy acts with global recognition, but it also introduces complications when original members are no longer evenly participating. Management structures, licensing rights, and estate considerations after the deaths of Davy Jones in 2012 and Peter Tork in 2019 further complicated the financial map. The band was no longer simply negotiating among four individuals. It was navigating estates, partial lineups, and legacy stakeholders. By the time later reunion cycles emerged in the 2010s, particularly anniversary-driven tours and special performances, the emotional tone had shifted. What once was a rebellion against producer control had transformed into negotiation over legacy presentation. The same questions resurfaced in different forms. How much of the Monkees should be nostalgia? How much should be reinvention? And who had the authority to decide the balance? Even successful tours carried this duality. Audiences experienced celebration, but behind the scenes, production decisions often reflected compromise rather than consensus. The Monkees were still commercially powerful as a brand, but internally they functioned less like a unified band and more like a rotating framework of memory, performance, and contractual obligation. By the end of their touring history, especially after the deaths of key members, the group's reunions were no longer attempts to restore the band. They were attempts to manage a legacy that had outgrown the structure that created it. Why Micky Dolenz refused the Monkees reunion tour. Micky Dolenz was the last consistently active performer of the group's catalog. After the original breakup phase of the Monkees in the early 1970s, Micky Dolenz did not disappear from entertainment, but he also did not immediately position himself as a full-time legacy performer. His trajectory split into three parallel lanes: acting, behind-the-scenes work, and gradual return to music. Dolenz worked heavily in television directing and production, including directing episodes of shows like Wheelies and later working in British and American TV environments. He also recorded solo material, though none of it matched the commercial scale of the Monkees' 1960s peak. This period matters because it separated him from the band identity for years at a time. He was no longer locked into Monkees branding, which changed how he later approached it. The 1986 reunion tour reactivated the brand commercially, but it also reintroduced the same structural problem from the 1960s. The Monkees were always part TV history, part music catalog, and part nostalgia machine. Dolenz increasingly became the most stable touring figure across later decades. Meanwhile, other members cycled in and out. That long touring history is where the key philosophical shift happened. Over time, Dolenz stopped treating Monkees shows as reunions of a working band and started treating them as historical performances. In interviews, he consistently described concerts as storytelling frameworks, where songs were not just played, but explained in context, how they were recorded, who played what in 1966 to 1967 sessions, what NBC's production system was like, and how internal conflicts shaped specific records like Headquarters and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited. This is where the contrast with standard reunion tour proposals becomes important. However, the commercial engine behind reunion proposals was moving in the opposite direction. Promoters in the nostalgia touring circuit typically optimize for scale and predictability, maximum recognition per song, minimal deviation from familiar arrangements, and tightly scheduled set lists built around chart peaks like I'm a Believer, Daydream Believer, and Last Train to Clarksville. In that model, the show is not a historical narrative. It is a replay system designed to trigger instant audience recognition. Dolenz's position consistently leaned away from that reduction. He treated the Monkees not as a static playlist, but as a layered history that included their formation in 1965 as a television construct, their 1967 revolt against producer Don Kirshner, the brief autonomy of Headquarters, and the later fragmentation of touring lineups across the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. In other words, the songs were inseparable from the story that created them. By the late 2010s, the idea of a clean, triumphant final Monkees reunion tour had already fractured. The original lineup collapsed. The death of Davy Jones in 2012, the passing of Peter Tork in 2019, and the death of Michael Nesmith in 2021 transformed the Monkees from a functioning group into a shrinking historical footprint, anchored largely by Dolenz as the last active performer. Proposals for revival tours broke apart at the design stage. One version demanded a streamlined greatest hits package with minimal dialogue. The other required a curated historical performance that included storytelling, archival context, and emotional acknowledgement of deceased members. In a standard arena touring model, those two approaches could not coexist. Dolenz's later performances made his position clearer. He favored solo and selective Monkees shows that blended hit songs with deeper cuts and spoken explanations of studio conditions, television production at NBC in the 1960s, and the internal tensions that shaped albums like Headquarters. This approach prioritized preservation of context over simplified repetition. Promoters, by contrast, operated on scalability, repeatable shows, predictable pacing, and maximum ticket throughput. Story-driven performances disrupted that system, slowing momentum and reducing uniformity across cities. That structural mismatch, not a single dramatic rejection, created the illusion of refusal. By the end, the The Monkees no longer functioned as a band in the traditional sense, but as a cultural archive in motion. The question was no longer about reunion, but about interpretation. Dolenz's stance reflected that shift, not resistance to performing, but resistance to flattening a complex, manufactured, and later reclaimed history into a simplified nostalgia product. And he has every right to fight for what he believes. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.